My name is Margaret Moss. I'm the Assistant Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at the School of Nursing. And some things have come up about taking care of patients and so forth that led me to propose to other schools in the AHC that maybe we need to have a diversity committee looking at the professions that are actually touching people and talking to people, which might be a little different issues than other schools. So this is our first effort. I'm together with Heather Orm in public health and Margarita Dubakovich in medicine, me in nursing so far. So we just thought, well, let's get going. We've been talking about this for about a year. So before solidifying everything, we decided to just start with diversity grand rounds because of the situations of how to take care of diverse people. So I'm starting because this is Native American Heritage Month, November. And so I thought that I would start out and talk about some issues that most people really don't know about, which lead, it's all historical, but it leads to where we are today and how you might find this patient presenting in front of you today. Are you going to know all this stuff? Because it's all the stuff that's likely causing a lot of the problems. So I'm taking on like a little historical tour as to why. You know, people always say, oh, can't they get over it? That was 200 years ago and so forth. So I'm answering those questions today with this presentation, I hope. So I am an enrollee of the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and that is the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. And I will get started. So I'm taking you through a little tour first, but it's all leads to your patient today, so that's why I'm doing it. Oh, sorry, forgot what I was doing. To hit these things. So American Indians have experienced great cultural, land, and life losses through targeted, sustained, persistent policies, both federal, state, local, more than almost any other group. And yet you don't really, it's not in America's consciousness, which is part of the problem. Nobody's ever thinking about American Indians, what they went through, or anything else. And if I present in front of you, you might not even know I'm an American Indian because people aren't thinking about American Indians. So that's another problem I'll talk about in a minute. The traumas of their ancestors, which are plenty, are manifested in the present day population through a variety of physical and mental symptomology. Collectively, this is known as historical trauma, as termed by Braveheart in the late 1980s. I think she's a social worker, I believe, and it was part of her dissertation, but it's really grabbed the consciousness of this area of study. Unresolved grief, these are part of the big symptoms of historical trauma. Whoops, I keep forgetting how you work this. Here we go. Sorry about that. I have to hit this arrow. So therefore, special programming and care techniques are needed beyond normal care. So in other words, you would do what you would do for most people, whatever the, do they have diabetes? Are they depressed? Did they break their leg? However, you're going to have to know that then there's stuff beyond that that you may have to attend to that you might not think about in the general population. So being Indian, I always give a little test, although don't cheat those of you who know the answers. Anyway, being Indian has been set apart from the general population by laws and policies historically and currently. This is one of the things I have my PhD in nursing, but I also have a law degree, and this is what drove me to law school, was what is happening. And I learned this was my phrase, but I love it, that American Indians in healthcare are the most regulated people in the most regulated system. So if you think everybody else has trouble navigating, there's literally a U.S. code, Title 25, entitled Indians. No other U.S. code is for a population, just American Indians. This is a case that basically says that you're only an Indian if Congress says you're an Indian, is the bottom line. Was anyone aware of that? Congress says who's a tribe. Congress, not the tribes. And then the tribes say who's a member. So that's why I say by extension. If Congress says you're no longer a tribe, in the eyes of the U.S., you're no longer an Indian. Doesn't matter if you're full blood or whatever, you're no longer an Indian in the eyes of the U.S., meaning you no longer have protections from treaties, ability to use Indian Health Service, get Indian education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's by their whim. So therefore, this design that the dominant governing body can legislate one's existence in or out has certainly led to trust issues. So when you come to your American Indian patient or whoever, and they're a little reticent to talk to you or say things or do things, that's one reason that I bet a lot of you weren't even aware of. But Indians know. And the reason I say Indians all the time, people always ask me, is because it's the legal term. It's actually the legal term in both U.S. and Canada. Even though we say Native Americans or we say First Nations, the legal term in both countries is actually still Indian. So, being Indian in the U.S. is a political determination. Who knew that? It's not racial. It's a political determination, which is why when I became a nurse in the Santa Fe Indian Hospital in New Mexico, there's a thing called Indian preference, and it's because it's a political determination. Otherwise, it would be discrimination to say we want to hire Indians. So what do we mean by that? It's just like if you're going to work for the State Department, they're probably going to hire a U.S. citizen. Same thing, we're citizens of our tribes, therefore we can say we're going to hire tribal citizens. Were people aware of that? It's a political, and just to put a point on that, when my girls were born, they were born 13 months apart, and so I was very good with the paperwork, got them all in, got them all enrolled. My boys, I'm like, I'll get to it. So in that period, when they were enrolled and they weren't, they were Indians and they weren't, even though they were full siblings. So in the eyes of the U.S., unless you're enrolled, you are not an Indian. It's a political, not a racial determination. That's important to know if you're a nurse, doctor, or whatever, and if you need to refer somebody to Indian Health Service, Seneca Health Nation, wherever, you have to know, are they eligible? And to be eligible, you have to be an Indian in the eyes of the U.S. They have to be an enrolled member. So here's my little quiz. Indians can't answer. How many U.S. federally recognized tribes are there? Anybody? Just sing it out. Any? Oh, you cheat. You can't talk either. Did everybody hear that though? 567. Is anybody surprised? I ask that everywhere I go, and I get anywhere between 3 and 1 million. Because people have only heard of Navajo, Sioux, as they say, and Cherokee. So they all think there's 3, or they guess 1 million. I don't know why. How many state-recognized tribes? Anybody? And what's the difference? There's 66. There's sometimes counted a little more because there's overlap. They're both state and federally recognized, but just purely state recognized. So that means that the federal government refused to recognize them, but the state realizes that they've been there forever. They're an actual community. They've fallen all the categories and definitions for Indian tribes, and so they will recognize them for state programs. But they still can't go to Indian Health Service and federal programs. How many in New York? How many? 30? Anybody else? There's 8 federally recognized and 3 state recognized. And who had this land before us? Seneca. And when did Indians get the right to vote? This is my last quiz. Anybody? 1924. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a second. So the 14th Amendment, can't help it, it's my law stuff, says that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are subject to the jurisdiction thereof and are citizens. This gave slaves and black freemen citizenship and vote for males. We know women came later for everybody. Then the courts ruled this did not include Indians, specifically did not include Indians. And citizen must be directly bestowed by the United States. Were people aware of this? So Indians were out. Oh, sorry, this went down, but that just says 1924 at the bottom there. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which allowed Indians to become citizens if they abandoned their ways and became Christians, farmed, spoke English, etc. And then in 1920, the women were getting the right to vote. Indians, 1924, the very last people in the U.S. to get the right to vote were Indians. Did people know this history? Did anybody learn any of this? You guys don't count. Because we never learned this. K through 12, college, anywhere, it's just sort of hidden. So here's some people. Do you think that they were citizens? This is before 1924-ish, but past 1900. How many people think they were citizens? Do they look like they were farming and speaking English and being Catholics? And no, they were not. The little one is my grandfather, and the bigger one's my great-grandfather. So even though we think cowboys and Indians and all that is way in the past, it's not that far in the past. And so this is my mother, and she was the first one in my line to be born as a citizen. So it's not that far back that American Indians were not citizens. And then we say, well, why don't they just listen to us? We're the government, we're here to help, or the health professional, or whoever. You know, who was helping all the way up? Nobody. So why would they think you're going to help them now? So you have to keep that in mind when you're a health professional. So I like to talk about structural determinants of health, which is what all this legal policy stuff is, which is going to lead to health. And I'll demonstrate that. So it's from all three branches of the government getting rid of the Indian problem. So you have the Supreme Court with the federal trust responsibility and the legislative and executive carrying out these policy periods. And as you remember from Schoolhouse Rock, legislative made the laws, executive carried them out. So you have the removal era, the horrible Trail of Tears, reservation era where everybody said, you live here, and it's usually in the worst parts. Allotment and assimilation with the boarding schools and breaking up land. They always say there's a pendulum swing in Indian federal law, although it's mostly swinging the other way. One of them going to the positive was Indian reorganization, where they tried to give some local control back and so forth, but you see that one lasted 6 years compared to everything else. Termination era is when the U.S. government said to 100 tribes, you're no longer tribes. So that's that thing I told you about. By the sufferance of Congress, they can legislate you in and out, and they did in the 50s. So there would have been almost 700 tribes. They just said, boom, you're no longer tribes, we owe you nothing. Even though there were treaties and policies and so forth on the book for hundreds of years. And now we're supposedly in a upswing. It's taking a long, and that's the Indian Self-Determination era, in which there's the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, Indian Education and Self-Determination and so forth, but we have made almost zero strides, and in fact things are going backwards, which I'll demonstrate. And there's your friend, President Andrew Jackson. I always tell Marcia she has these friends. Okay. So the Marshall Trilogy, I'm not going to say anything other than this is what guides Indian law and policy today. Things made in 1803 is still the basis for federal Indian law. What do you think the mindset of 1800s was about American Indians? And that's still what's guiding all Indian law today. So think about that. Who's aware of, first of all, who's been to Mount Rushmore? Anybody? I mean, it's a fascinating, beautiful wonder and all that. However, Has anybody heard of these four described as the four horsemen of the American Indian apocalypse? That's what it is to Indians. And I put it up here because you can't get much more structural than these presidents blasted into granite in the sacred lands of the people of this area. So think of people that are, horrifying to another population, and then they're not only forced to look at these people, but in their sacred land. And yet nobody's thinking about this. So what do you think the Indians are thinking? So what do we mean by that? Did you know that George Washington called for the extermination of the Iroquois? So takes the tenets of the Constitution from them, takes the bald eagle symbol from them, and then says, get rid of them. Were people aware of this? Thomas Jefferson was the architect of the Trail of Tears. Everybody thinks it's your friend back there, Andrew Jackson. He carried it out. It was the brainchild of President Jefferson. Did anyone know that? Teddy Roosevelt, known to say things such as, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Now, I just took you from 1700s to 1900s. These are our presidents. So how do you think American Indians fare under hundreds of years of this? Hundreds of years of this. And if that's what they're saying at the top, what do you think's happening at the local level? It's not good, I can tell you that. Abraham Lincoln, who could say anything bad about him, the great emancipator, right? Did you know that he ordered the largest mass execution in U.S. history, holding today as the largest mass execution in U.S. history on U.S. soil by the government, and it was Indians. He's our 16th. Who knew that? So I got a little thing here, and I want you to remember this because it's going to lead towards our case. So it's called what Lincoln did, the Dakota 38, happened in Mankato, Minnesota, 1862, the day after Christmas. And he ordered the hanging, actually wanted to do 300 men and boys. Some of these are boys. So, most of them didn't speak English. They didn't have any, like a 5-minute trial, if anything, and then they were hung. He decided to go to 38. I don't know why 38, because he thought, what will Europe think if we're just hanging 300? I mean, this is Lincoln. And then there were 2 extras, so it's always called the Dakota 38 plus 2. This happened 7 generations ago, just by coincidence, 7 generations ago, so I want you to remember that. Here's a little newspaper history, and look at the gallows there, because that's going to come up again. They just hung 40 people with almost no trial. Just, they wanted the land. Who knew that Lincoln did this? Anybody? And people will say, well, what does that have to do with today? Well, you'll find out. So here's another structural problem. So laws, policies, all that's a structural problem. Funding is huge. So by treaties, the U.S. government was ceded millions of land from American Indians across the country. And they said, in return, we will take care of you, health care needs, whatever it is, education, whatever, we'll take care of you. Everybody signed on the dotted line, and then this is what happened. If you remember from civics, treaties are the highest law of the land, along with the Constitution. So health care is based in treaties. It's supposed to be way up here. The rest of these federal programs, this is a graph of federal programs who provide health care. Medicare, Medicaid, VA, federal health. And the one that I don't have on here, but it's usually on, this is an IHS slide, Indian Health Service slide, is federal prisoner care, which is double. They get twice the funding per capita as American Indians. Federal prisoners. All these other ones besides Indian Health Service are based in public law. Indian Health Service is based in treaties. It should be the highest. They get the least per capita, and it shows in all the outcomes. Prisoners. Literally, there's stories of American Indians offending because they have diabetes and need a kidney or whatever to get into prison so they can get some actual care. Oh, I keep forgetting about this. Okay, so that's funding is huge. Indian Health Service is funded by Congress. It's funded at 40% of need. Contract care is a big part of it. What they can do themselves in their facilities is very limited, so then there's contract care. They say contract care has a fancy new name, but I'll call it contract care. There's sayings in Indian country, you better get sick by June because the money will be gone and it's only for life and limb. So if you're not about to die or lose a limb, you can forget it. There's no money. So here's a little framework I've come up with where in our health professions, of course, we have to do healthcare and health outcomes. You have to learn your labs and your meds and your wound care and whatever it is you learn. Because you have to. That's why you're there, and that's overall pretty good. However, we really need to get to social determinants of health. Social determinants of health are those things like poverty, education, food security, safety, and so forth. Studies have shown having health care and a doctor and insurance is only 15% of your health. 85% are those other things. 85%. Yet where do we focus our care in professional schools? Usually is up here. We're just now starting to get to some talk about social determinants of health, SES, social economic considerations and so forth, but it's not a huge part of the program, whereas it's 85% of your health care. Oh, I keep forgetting about that. I keep forgetting. And then what I'm talking about, especially for American Indians, because they are the most regulated people in the most regulated system, you better know about structural determinants of health, which are the policies, the funding. Until that changes, we're going to be giving out insulin until the cows come home, and nobody's ever going to get fixed. We need to fix funding. We need to fix people's fundamental understanding of the history, politics, etc., of the geography of where they are before we can ever really fix that top block. So most of the stuff, if I'm just speaking of American Indians now, we might know about health outcomes because we're pretty much like everybody else except for this other stuff that's been happening, which is big, which we need to know. Social determinants of health, we're sort of scratching the surface, but we really don't know about American Indians. And structural, nobody knows anything so far. So my little example there is if you go to Rapid City, South Dakota, and somebody comes in to see you in your clinic and they have diabetes, and you say, okay, you did whatever you had to do, everything looks good for, checkoffs and accrediting bodies and so forth. You say, okay, go put your insulin in a refrigerator, keep your wound clean, and go for walks. Come back in 3 months. You did everything. Your books look great. Everything looks great except that patient who just went home to his blown out single wide. He doesn't have refrigeration. He can't reach his wound. He's got nobody to help. And it's not safe to walk, either because there's no sidewalks or there's dogs or it's just not safe. Or it's 30 below. Only nobody asked, nobody cared, but all their paperwork looks good. You did nothing for that patient. You have to know their context. And they're not just going to tell you. You have to find out. It's on you instead of the sick person having to instruct you. So that's why you need to know about context for your patients. These are your social determinants. I'm not going out of it, but I just want you to think, what if you had to pick one from that list? What would you give up? Poverty? Would you be poverty stricken, have no transportation, worry about your safety? Education, what? And if you're American Indian, you probably have to pick 3 or 4 or several down that list, and that's how you're living. You have to realize that. Whether you're urban or whether you're reservation. Here's the outcomes from everything I just told you. Lowest life expectancies in America, not just Indian country, not just America, but the Western Hemisphere. Who knew that? American Indians, in certain cases, have the lowest life expectancies in the Western Hemisphere and going backwards, lower than Haiti. Who knew this? So on my tribe, which is in North Dakota, in the middle of nowhere, I just saw the numbers. life expectancy of a male. Now, in U.S., it's 78 for white males, 81 for white females. What do you think it is on my tribe? A baby boy born today can expect to live to, on average, what? Anybody? Sing it out. 60? 37? It's 49. 49, that's lower than Haiti. And I'm not the worst. Pine Ridge, Rosebud, I think they're the worst. They're hovering around the 40 mark. Some tell me 38-ish. Some tell me 45-ish. Females on my tribe is 53. So I tell my kids, you better be nice, but I'm living on borrowed time right now. So anyway, I don't have to recite this. Everything's worse. Everything's worse. And these are averages. So you go to the Pima tribe in California, well known to have the highest rates of diabetes in the world. The world, not just the U.S. And who knows any of this and who's doing anything about any of this? And when do you hear any of this on CNN, in New York Times, anywhere, anytime? It's desperate, but you hear about all other countries, but you never hear about Indians. And that's on purpose. So, history is sort of repeating itself. I like to put up this little graphic that I call the medicine wheel meets the iron triangle. So the medicine wheel can be seen in these different things that I've listed. Either the person, 4 domains, physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, the lifespan, infant, adolescent, adult, elder, the 4 directions, the elements, fire, water, and so forth. It's used for many of these things. Sometimes it's rotated, sometimes the colors are a little different, but basic idea is the same for most tribes. And then you have the iron triangle of health policy in states and federal government. And you see never the twain, think of your kindergarten, round peg, square hole. They're just not communicating. It's just not going together. Thus, no funding. There's no Indian Affairs Committee anymore in the House side. In fact, Indians are listed under, what is it? Forestry or something to that effect. Here's a little aside. I went to Australia last October, and I blew their mind with my stuff, and they blew mine. Because Aborigine people, according to what they were telling me, and I heard it from several sources, were categorized as flora and fauna, not as people, until 1964. And the thing that broke them out, supposedly, and I heard this, I'll give you a little aside again of the aside, is that, who remembers, you guys are all so young, Yvonne Goolagong. She was a famous Aboriginal tennis player. And she needed to go to Wimbledon, which she won. But how do you get flora and fauna passport? So they had to do some scrambling. And I was going, oh, that's terrible. And then I remembered, oh, yeah, that's about where we are on the house side. We're under, I forget, something with plants, forestry, this kind of stuff. That's where we are. So again, if you are that and you know it, and that's where people put you, again, when people say, oh, let me help you, what are you thinking? So this is my same model. I'm just going to run through 2 examples. So the structure at the bottom, Supreme Court cases, Marshall Trilogy, those 3 cases from the 1800s that hold today. One of them, the outcome was that we are domestic dependent nations. We aren't full sovereigns. So they have to, quote unquote, take care of us. How did they take care of us? They put us on reservations. Those are the 2 federal policy periods at play right here. This is a picture of my chairman. Some places people call them chiefs, governors, chairman. On my tribe, it's chairman. Chairman Gillette, and he's crying. It's about 1950, and he has been forced to let our reservation flood. So what happens? The Missouri River comes diagonally through our reservation. The white farmers' land kept flooding, and so their fix was to flood my reservation. There went everything. The hospitals, the schools, the towns, houses. People had to move up, and thus we have a place called Newtown, North Dakota, on the Fort Berthold Reservation. And what was up? Nothing. No vegetation, nothing. North Dakota. So I keep forgetting these little things. It's hard to stand it. Go. So the social determinants of health that we just talked about, so that was structural. That's why I say it feeds then into social, which is the loss of the school, hospital, farmland, homes, and so forth. That was in 1950, roughly. And the health outcomes today are some of the highest diabetes rates, lowest life expectancy, highest mental and emotional ills. Still here. What did it come from? Structural problems. You can have all the doctors you needed, but until you fix this stuff, that thought, oh, let's just flood the Indians. Until you fix mindsets like that, you're never going to get anywhere. And I think we talked a little bit about this at Hillary's, hi Hillary, Indigenous Women's Conference. But it's something I rail against due to the legal aspect of it. How many know about the problem of violence against American Indian women? A few of you. This is how bad it is. 10 times the murder rate of the next closest group. Who knew that? On reservations. 10 times the rate. So for every Lacey Peterson that went missing, 10 more Indian, but nobody's noticing. It's never hit, again, never hits the news. There's a theme here. You'll never hear about anything. You didn't learn about anything. You don't hear about anything. You don't see anything. You don't know anything. And that's by design. That's a Department of Justice statistic. There is this, you can't see it very well, this artist, Métis artist in Canada, Winnipeg, Jamie Black, who came up with it. She does these installations all over of these red dresses, each one representing a murdered or missing Indigenous woman, the Red Dress Project. So, I'm not going to go through the blocks again, but Violence Against Women Act specifically never included American Indians. Was anyone aware of that? There's an act, Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, specifically cut out American Indians. Any reason? Anybody have any? Why would you? This is another reason why I went into law. These are two federal laws clashing, and guess which one won? It's two federal laws clashing. So one law says, still on the books, remember that 1800 stuff, that if a non-Indian comes onto Indian lands, they have little prosecutorial or ability to hold people no matter what they did. So in other words, you can come on, do God knows what, and they do. And this is mostly white men, border towns, etc. They come on, they do God knows what. They know A, they'll probably never get found, and B, if they are ever prosecuted, tribes can only hold people for 364 days. They only have the right to hold people for 1 day less than a year. You could murder someone and get 364 days, and then you have, because of double jeopardy, when you leave, you're fine. They know it. There's very little going to happen to them. So a tribe like mine has 1 million acres in the middle of North Dakota. There are 19 tribal police, and they're not all on at the same time. So if you can imagine 6 people patrolling 1 million acres, what do you think's going to happen? Nothing. And they know it. And so it's literally called open season on American Indian women out on the reservations. Oh, I was able to recruit I was at Yale before this and recruited the chief of the Mohegans, who was a nurse with a master's, into our DMP program. And I was her advisor. She was telling me one time that she went to some chief meeting in the middle of the country, and her and some chiefs were sitting up here, and there were tables of breakout with women and girls and whatnot. And at this table, there were like tweens sitting there saying, well, when I get raped. Not if, When. So again, we have to think, if you can't even, if you have to worry about making it to the next day in one piece, are you thinking about the Pythagorean theorem and geographical, landmarks and Shakespeare? No, you're just trying to get to the next. So we always say, well, they flunk out, they're not good students, blah, blah, blah. You have to know all that context. If they even make it out of high school, that was a huge achievement. So, violence against women. Here's the problem. So Obama authorized for the first time that Indians could be in it. So we go, oh, okay, good, and we go away. So many problems with this. But you see the photo op, and then people think, oh, it's all good. It's not all good. Why? It was a pilot for 3 tribes. How many tribes did we say there were? 567. Pilot for 3 tribes. It has to be domestic violence. That's what Violence Against Women Act is. What did I just say? Who was doing it, did I say? White men from off the reservation coming on. You have to have non-Indians on your juries. You have to agree to that. That could be a slippery slope. Because what else are they going to jury? Pretty soon, what? About land, water rights, etc. So people don't want to sign up for this. And then there's a cost to the tribes for signing up. I think we're up to 11 tribes out of all that who thought, maybe we'll do it. So it looks good, but it didn't do anything. I can tell you I'm on Facebook feeds. That's where the only place you find American Indian news, right? And I would say, if I had to guess, I've seen 10 murdered and missing women in the last month through the Facebook feeds. Have you heard about this on CNN or anywhere else? No. I don't mean to pick on them. It's all of them. Okay. So this is my last area. The bottom line of this is it's unseen. It's never heard. It's all historical trauma from everything I just told you. Ends up in toxic stress. So much for that. So anyway, Mitakoye Oyasin Lakota, for we are all related. I like to see that in conjunction with injustice anywhere as a threat to justice everywhere. Think about those 2 terms. So I only have like 3 more slides. This summer in Minneapolis, anybody hear about a thing happening in Minneapolis this summer? See? It was horrifying. A replica gallows, remember I told you to think of that gallows from 7 generations ago. A replica gallows, such as President Lincoln's, was commissioned by the Walker Art Museum in the Twin Cities as art and built. Horrifying. So that'll lead to the case I'm telling you about. But I have just a 2-minute here of what the Indians thought about this. So anyway, that went on in Minneapolis, like in end of May, beginning of June. Did anyone hear about this? Seriously. In this same week, I just happened to notice there was a single news found in the South somewhere, I don't know, South Carolina or something. Horrifying, but it hit all the major news. And the same week, I think it was LeBron James, the N-word was written on his garage, hit all the national news. A gallows big enough to hang 40 people, nothing. Again, so if you don't think that this is designed silence over hundreds of years, even today, and this is now 7 generations of this thing happening. Oh, I got to get past that. So, simple case, because I needed all that to bring you up to speed. So, a woman in her 20s went to see this. She heard about it, went over there. She's an enrollee of a federally recognized tribe, not the Dakota, which is the tribe that was hung. She views the structure, gets goosebumps, feels despair, confusion, trauma. She notices only American Indians are there, protesting, crying, hurt, put up things. Like, where's everybody else? How come all of a sudden, and I'm not saying right or left, both, when you're doing Indian law and affairs, both sides, neither of them do anything. So this isn't right, left either. However, Minneapolis is quite a liberal stronghold. Where were all the usual suspects, protesting and marching? Nobody was there but Indians. The people she did see were kids playing on the structure like it was a playground, people walking their dogs nearby, not a care in the world. So she tells her mother what she sees and feels, and her mother tells her that is historical trauma, and the ancestors are speaking to you. She felt it, but the general public didn't. The Indians are crying and putting up signs and so forth and horrified. Nobody else is. Nobody. This is several months ago. So, as a health professional, would you know what's going on should this woman present to you? What if she was crying and, out of sorts and had no real explanation? And so would you even know all this history I just told you that could be feeding into however she's thinking or feeling? Or would you just, she'd probably get the usual anxiety meds and be sent on her way and say, oh, do you want a counselor who also probably doesn't know anything about what she needs or feels. So this is a huge learning curve for this academic health, center or any other in America, because you don't learn this K through 12. You don't learn this in college. You don't hear it on the news. So unless you're in American Indian Health or Facebook feeds, that's the only way you heard about the pipeline for the most part, about this gallows, about anything. It just doesn't and so what do you think the average American Indian thinks? These horrifying things are happening. Even today, this was months ago, and nobody knows or cares. So this is just a 1 minute of what they did was bring in Indian elders. They were told, take it down. And then it was going to be dismantled by American Indian people and then taken to Fort Snelling and burned. I don't know if they actually got to the burning, and that was originally, because then some people thought, oh, that's too much care for this thing. So I really don't know what happened, but that was the thing that was going to be dismantled by American Indians and taken to Fort Snelling and possibly burned. But this is just one of the elders talking just for like 1 minute, and then I'm just about done.
Objects and our sacred people who stood on these scaffolds at Mankato and at Fort Snelling. We have to remember their prayer. That is our obligation and responsibility as people who practice our belief system. We have to remember what their prayer was before they walked on this gallows. We have to have that courage and understanding to represent that. Our ceremonies do that for us. That is who we are. It is the center of our motherhood, the center of our star nation, that beautiful spirit we have. So this is a part of education that needs to be real.
So I looked at the time. That's why I keep bugging about CNN. Nothing on the news, nothing on their site. Same with Fox and MSNBC. Just zero stories. Nothing. Yet a single news somewhere makes the news. So this is the last one. So you should always assume trauma when you have an American Indian patient in front of you. Just always assume trauma. Rule it out. Caring for American Indian, Alaska Native patients, you need to understand all these things I just told you, the historical and current context of care. Understand how, where to take action. Find out where your advocacy is if you don't have the knowledge and so forth to take care of someone. You better build liaisons and so forth. Understand that both social and structural determinants of health affect health status probably more than whether they have a doctor or not. Native healthcare professionals are perfectly poised to step into this gap because invisibility will not be the problem. And then in a shameless plug, a lot of this is in my book. So anyway, that's what I had for you, and I thank you for your attention, and I'd be glad to take any questions. Anybody? It's kind of business as usual. I've been back a couple of times. In fact, I just came back from Bemidji, Minnesota on Friday, and about half of the people I was talking to just that far away had heard about it and half hadn't, because again, it's not on the news. So sometimes people don't know, but they always know that potential's there. You're always guarding your back. You always wonder what people are thinking and doing and so forth, and whether you can trust anybody. So that's the major thing with healthcare professionals. There is, for Indian Health Service, there's what's called direct care, and then this contract care. They changed the name recently. I can't remember what it is, but basically care you can get at a facility and care they have to contract out. Well, there's only about 2 or 3 hospitals that actually do surgery, deliver babies, whatever. Or if you need an MRI or anything beyond, let's say, probably basic laboratory and x-ray, you have to go somewhere. And that's when that contract care, which is under tribal say-so, whether they're going to pay for it, because they have no, it's 40% need. So people probably need really 140% pay, not just to bring them up to where everybody else is and then what they need. Instead, they're at 40%. So the tribe has to say, well, what are we going to pay for? What are we not going to pay for? And the person probably can't pay for anything. So they'll either go without or have these huge bills, and you know, it's pretty desperate out there. Well, that's what several of us will get together and say all the time. It's like, okay, the artist had to come up with this. They had to come into contracts with the Walker Out Museum. They had to talk amongst themselves. Oh yeah, this is a good idea. Let's pay them almost $100,000 to put this thing up. Did anyone talk to an Indian? It was unbelievable to me. So I still have a house there. So I happened to see it in one of my feeds, and one of my daughters was watching the house. I'm like, quick, go over there and take pictures. So she literally took those pictures. And I'm like, I can't believe this. And it just, you didn't see it anywhere. One big problem is identification at all. So at least you have people self-identifying or something. Because that's one of my little stories is I recently had a procedure here, just a small procedure. And I actually see the people at Seneca Health Nation. So here come my records from Seneca Nation Health. It says all over it I'm American Indian. And when I discharged, it all said white. So I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I'm admitted as an Indian and I'm discharged white. Nobody's paying attention. So how, and I'm sure these, and I've been to many houses, I've had 4 kids, several things here and there. This happens all the time. Total misidentification. So if you don't even know who the person in front of you is, how can you ever say you're giving culturally competent care? I don't like that term, but it's what we've got. You know, and these magnet hospitals that say, oh, they're doing all that. Nobody's ever asked me how I identify. So that's number one. Number one, I always ask everybody, how do you identify? If you want to identify. I also don't strong arm people, but I give them the chance. So that's number one, identify. The second problem is, even if they do identify, what do you got for them? What's next? What if they say, you know, I'm a hardcore, full blood from the reservation. What are you going to do for them? You got nothing, I guarantee. You know, Maybe they need connections for sweats. Maybe they need smudging. Maybe they need somebody from their own tribe. Maybe they need the right person as their healthcare advocate. In tribes I worked with in the Southwest, like the Zuni, paternal aunts, so it's the actual person making your medical decisions. Are they around? Were you able to consult with them? Things like that. People just always give usual care, so that was one of my first ones. Sure, you have to do what you do with everybody else, but then you have to know this other stuff. So if you ask identity, the next thing, what can I do for it? What do you need? Because of this information, help me, help you. If you always ask things with humility and respect, nobody's going to put you down. Is there something that we need to do for you? The third thing, besides identity and ask them what do they need, number 3 is what I said on one of those slides, always assume trauma, always assume trauma, always. Because American Indians are not only getting this historical trauma, which nobody believed until you can show it epigenetically, so now that it's scientific, now people can believe it. So you're getting this historical trauma from above, and the worst contemporaneous trauma of anybody. I just told you women are murdered at 10 times the rate. They have the highest suicide, highest homicide, highest alcoholism and substance abuse due to most of this stuff. So the highest traffic accidents, which many people think are actually suicides. So highest contemporaneous traumas, highest historical traumas, all crashing within that person. And then you say, why can't you get over it? So yes, you always have to assume trauma. Now I lost that buzz phrase. What is it? Trauma something care? Trauma-informed care. There you go. Go down that path. If you find they don't need it because they have good support systems, other things, fine. But you should always assume trauma. So you have to know who they are, what they need, and always assume trauma. Yeah. So that's what I've learned over the years. But I don't want to keep you long, but any other comment or question? Okay, well, eat those chips, and thank you for coming.